Hauptmann Ernst Weber crouched in the early morning fog of Normandy, studying the hedgerow-lined field his company would have to cross. It was July 12, 1944, 5 weeks after D-Day, and the German defensive lines had held firm despite relentless Allied pressure. Weber commanded a company of the 342nd Infantry Division, veteran troops who had bloodied the Americans at Omaha Beach and who had fought with skill and determination ever since. The Americans pulled back from this sector yesterday, Lieutenant Klaus Fischer reported, consulting his map. Intelligence says they're consolidating to the south. The field ahead is clear. Our patrols checked it last night. No sign of enemy presence. Weber nodded, though something troubled him. The Americans didn't usually withdraw without reason, and they'd been fighting hard for this particular sector. The hedgerows here provided natural defensive positions. The terrain favored defense over attack, and yet the Americans had pulled back, leaving the field apparently uncontested. Any signs of artillery preparation? Pre-registered fire zones? Weber asked. None, sir. The area's been quiet all night. No shelling, no patrols, nothing. Still, Weber's instincts, honed by 3 years of combat on the Eastern Front before his transfer to France, warned him something was wrong. But orders were orders. Advance through the abandoned American positions, secure the hedgerow line beyond, and prepare for the expected American counterattack. His company of 150 men would be the spearhead. 1st Platoon, advance in line. Stay alert. 2nd Platoon, follow at 50 meters. 3rd Platoon, provide covering fire from current positions until 1st and 2nd are across. At 0630 hours, 1st Platoon moved out, 40 men advancing in a skirmish line across the seemingly innocent French field. The grass was knee-high, dotted with wildflowers, peaceful in the early morning light. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, a 22-year-old from Munich, was thinking about his girlfriend's latest letter when the ground beneath his left foot clicked. That click, barely audible, felt more than heard, was the last sound 17 men of 1st Platoon would ever hear clearly. The M1 anti-personnel mine that Dietrich had stepped on detonated with a blast that sent shrapnel in a 360-degree pattern, killing him instantly and wounding 2 men nearby. But that single explosion was just the beginning. The concussion from the first mine triggered a second, then a third. Within 5 seconds, a chain reaction of explosions tore through the field as mine after mine detonated, each blast triggering pressure waves that set off neighboring mines. The Americans had planted them in a pattern specifically designed for this effect, a technique that German combat engineers had never encountered before. Get back! Get back! Weber screamed, but the order came too late for many. Soldiers who tried to run triggered more mines with their panicked movement. Men who dropped to the ground found themselves lying on top of additional mines. The entire field, hundreds of square meters that looked so innocent, had been transformed into a killing zone more deadly than any artillery barrage. When the explosions finally stopped, 23 men of 1st Platoon were dead or dying, another 12 were wounded, and the survivors huddled at the field's edge, too traumatized to move. The abandoned American positions had been anything but abandoned. They'd been a carefully prepared trap, using a weapon that the Germans had not expected to encounter in such density or sophistication. Minen, someone shouted unnecessarily. The whole field is mined. Weber stared at the carnage with growing horror and realization. This wasn't standard mine placement, random mines scattered to delay or channel enemy movement. This was something new, something systematic, a minefield designed not just to kill but to terrify, to make every step forward potentially fatal, to transform ordinary ground into an invisible enemy. What Weber didn't know, what German intelligence would take weeks to fully understand, was that the Americans had developed a comprehensive mine warfare doctrine unlike anything the Wehrmacht had encountered, even on the Eastern Front. The U.S. had entered the war late but had learned from British experience in North Africa and had industrialized mine production with typical American efficiency. By mid-1944, American forces in Normandy had access to millions of mines of various types, and more importantly, they had developed tactics for employing them that went far beyond traditional military doctrine. The M1 anti-personnel mine that had killed Dietrich was just one weapon in an arsenal that included anti-tank mines, booby traps, and most devastatingly, the M2 Bouncing Betty, a mine that would launch itself 3 feet into the air before detonating. sending shrapnel at waist height, designed to maximize casualties. The Americans had learned from German use of similar weapons and had improved on the design, making them more reliable, easier to plant, and more deadly. "We need combat engineers," Fisher said, his voice shaking. "We can't advance through that field without clearing it, and we don't have the equipment or training for American mine patterns." "How long will that take?" Weber asked, though he already knew the answer would be unacceptable. "Hours, maybe days. And we'd need specialized equipment we don't have. The Americans use different arming mechanisms than we do. Some of their mines have anti-handling devices that explode if you try to dig them up. We can't just clear them the way we would Russian mines." Weber made a decision that saved the remainder of his company, but effectively ended their offensive capability. "Pull everyone back. Mark this field as impassable. We'll report to battalion that American minefields have made this approach impossible. They'll have to find another route." But as reports came in from other sectors throughout the day, a disturbing pattern emerged. The Americans had mined extensively across multiple sectors, transforming the entire front into a checkerboard of deadly ground that German forces couldn't safely traverse. Fields that looked clear were minefields. Roads that seemed open were death traps. Even buildings the Americans had abandoned often contained booby traps designed to kill German soldiers who entered carelessly. Colonel Frank Mitchell of the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division's Engineer Battalion stood on the same ridge where Weber's company had begun their fatal advance, watching through binoculars as German combat engineers cautiously probed the minefield his men had planted 2 days earlier. "How many mines did we lay in that field?" asked Lieutenant George Patterson, Mitchell's operations officer. 400 M1s in a standard pattern, plus 50 M2 bouncing Bettys at random intervals, plus 20 M1A1 anti-tank mines on the most likely vehicle approaches," Mitchell replied with the precision of an engineer discussing a construction project. "Total coverage, approximately 600 meters by 400 meters. Laying time, 6 hours with a 40-man team. Cost in materials, negligible. We have literally millions of these mines in the supply chain." Patterson whistled low. "The Germans are going to need days to clear that, and they'll take casualties doing it. That's the idea. Every day they spend clearing mines is a day they're not attacking. Every casualty they take to mines is one less soldier shooting at our infantry, and the psychological effect is even more valuable. After you've watched enough of your buddies get blown up by invisible weapons, you become very cautious, very slow, very reluctant to advance. That's worth more than the physical casualties." What Mitchell was describing was the systematic application of American industrial and organizational capacity to mine warfare. The United States had recognized early in the war that mines were among the most cost-effective weapons available, cheap to produce, easy to deploy, and devastating in their effects. A mine that cost $2 to manufacture could destroy a $50,000 tank or kill a soldier who had cost thousands of dollars to train and equip. By 1944, American industry was producing mines at a rate that would have seemed impossible to pre-war military planners. The Picatinny Arsenal in New Jersey alone was manufacturing over 50,000 anti-tank mines per month. The M1 anti-personnel mine was being produced by multiple manufacturers at combined rates exceeding 100,000 per month. And unlike German mines, which required precision manufacturing and skilled labor, American mines were designed for mass production, simple, reliable, and so cheap that they could be used prodigally without concern for cost. "The Germans don't understand logistics the way we do," Mitchell continued, warming to his subject. "They think about mines the way they think about artillery or tanks, as limited resources that need to be conserved and employed carefully. We think about them like we think about bullets, consumable items to be used as needed. We're mining entire sectors of the front just to deny them to the enemy, not because we expect attacks there, but because we can. We have that many mines available." The tactical application of this industrial capacity was revolutionary. American combat engineers had developed rapid deployment techniques that allowed them to lay dense minefields in hours rather than the days required by traditional methods. They used mechanical layers for anti-tank mines, could hand-plant anti-personnel mines at rates of 100 per hour per team, and had integrated mine warfare into combined arms doctrine in ways that maximized psychological and tactical impact. The minefield that had destroyed Weber's platoon exemplified these techniques. It had been laid with specific tactical purposes: deny German forces the use of apparently good terrain, channel any advance into kill zones covered by American artillery, and most importantly, create psychological pressure that would slow German reactions and make them hesitant to maneuver. But the Americans hadn't just mined in front of their lines. They'd also developed sophisticated techniques for mining behind German lines, using infiltration teams to plant mines on supply routes in likely assembly areas, and on routes German forces might use for withdrawal or reinforcement. These nuisance minefields, small clusters of mines in unexpected places, created paranoia among German troops, making them suspect every road, every trail, every piece of ground might be mined. Sergeant James Wilson, leading one such infiltration team from the 1st Infantry Division, described the tactic in his after-action report. "We moved behind German lines at night, planted 50 M1 mines on a road their supply trucks were using, then withdrew before dawn. Next night, we hit a different road 5 miles away. Third night, we went back to the first road and planted more mines on a section we'd left clear the first time. The Germans don't know where we've mined and where we haven't. They have to treat every road as potentially mined, which slows their supply movements to a crawl. We're creating logistical problems with about $100 worth of mines and 12 hours of work." The Germans attempted to adapt, deploying more combat engineers for mine clearance, developing new mine detection equipment, and changing tactical doctrine to account for the American mining threat. But they faced fundamental disadvantages. German mine detectors, designed primarily to detect metallic mines, were less effective against some American mines that used minimal metal in their construction. German combat engineers, though skilled, were too few to clear mines at the rate Americans were laying them. And German forces lacked the industrial capacity to countermine at similar scales. They simply didn't have millions of mines to deploy defensively. Oberst Karl Hoffmann, commanding a German pioneer battalion tasked with mine clearance, reported his frustration to division headquarters. "The Americans are planting mines faster than we can clear them. We clear a road today, they mine it again tonight. We mark cleared areas, they add mines to the cleared zones. We're not solving the problem. We're just running in place while taking casualties from clearance operations. Estimate we need 10 times our current engineer strength to keep pace with American mining operations. Request immediate reinforcement of engineer units and specialized mine clearance equipment." The request was denied, not because higher command didn't recognize the problem, but because Germany simply didn't have the resources to allocate. By mid-1944, German combat engineer strength was stretched thin across multiple fronts. Equipment was in short supply, and the industrial capacity to produce mine detectors and clearance tools was limited by Allied bombing and resource shortages. But the most insidious aspect of American mine warfare wasn't the physical mines themselves, it was the psychological warfare component that Mitchell had referenced. German soldiers began to develop what modern psychologists would call mine phobia, an intense fear of invisible threats beneath the ground that made every step forward an act of courage, that transformed normal military operations into exercises in terror management. Gefreiter Otto Schneider, a veteran infantryman who had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, described the psychological impact. "I've been under artillery fire hundreds of times. I've faced Russian tanks, fought in Stalingrad, survived things that killed most of my unit. But the American mines, those are different. You can't see them, can't hear them, can't know if the next step you take will be your last. After you've watched men die from mines a few times, watched them get blown apart by weapons they never saw coming, you start hesitating before every step. You watch the ground instead of watching for the enemy. You move slowly, carefully, and that makes you a better target for their snipers and machine guns. The mines kill some of us directly, but they affect all of us psychologically. This psychological dimension was precisely what American tactical doctrine intended. The official U.S. Army Field Manual on Mine Warfare explicitly stated that mines were as much psychological weapons as physical ones, that their value lay not just in casualties inflicted, but in fear generated, movement slowed, and tactical initiative disrupted. By August 1944, 2 months after D-Day, American mines had killed or wounded an estimated 3,000 German soldiers in the Normandy sector alone. But the indirect effects were far more significant. German forces that might have counterattacked quickly instead moved slowly, checking for mines. German supply convoys that might have moved efficiently instead crawled along roads with lead vehicles searching for mines. German troops that might have aggressively patrolled instead remained in defensive positions. unwilling to risk movement through potentially mined terrain. The Battle of Morton in early August 1944 illustrated the cumulative impact. When German forces launched their last major counteroffensive in Normandy, attempting to cut through American lines and reach the coast, their advance was repeatedly disrupted by minefields that American engineers had prepared in likely approach routes. German armor, attempting to bypass destroyed vehicles blocking roads, moved off-road and into anti-tank minefields. German infantry, trying to infiltrate around American positions, encountered anti-personnel minefields that their advance scouts missed in the darkness. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Heinz, commanding a panzer battalion in that offensive, survived the battle and was captured. In his interrogation, he provided insight into the German perspective. We knew the Americans had mines. Everyone uses mines. But we didn't realize the scale. Every route we tried was mined. Every alternative approach had mines. Fields that looked clear from aerial reconnaissance were actually minefields with grass growing over them. We lost 16 tanks to mines in the first 12 hours of the offensive, not from combat, just from driving into mined areas. That's more tanks than we lost to American tank destroyers and artillery combined. The mines didn't stop our offensive by themselves, but they slowed us enough that the Americans could bring up reserves and organize their defense. Without the mines, we might have achieved breakthrough. With them, we never had a chance. The human cost of mine warfare extended beyond battle casualties. Combat engineers on both sides who handled mines daily took enormous risks, and their casualty rates reflected those dangers. American engineer units in Normandy suffered casualty rates comparable to infantry units, with mine handling accidents accounting for a significant portion. When mines were armed and planted, any mistake could be fatal. When mines were being cleared under fire, the risk was even higher. Private First Class Daniel Murphy, a combat engineer with the 29th Infantry Division, survived the war, but lost both hands to a mine that detonated while he was attempting to clear it from a road near St. Lo. His account captures the engineer's perspective. We planted mines, we cleared mines, we lived with mines every day. You tried to be careful, tried to follow procedures, but you were always aware that one mistake would kill you. German mines were bad enough, but clearing our own mines was worse because you knew if something went wrong, it was your error. I cleared hundreds of mines during the campaign. The last one, I must have done something wrong. Pulled the wrong way, put pressure in the wrong place. I don't remember the explosion, just waking up in the field hospital without hands. Lucky to be alive, the doctor said. Mines don't usually leave survivors. The German experience was even worse. German combat engineers clearing American minefields faced booby traps and anti-handling devices specifically designed to kill clearance personnel. American engineers had learned from German booby trap techniques and had improved on them, creating mines that would explode if moved, that would detonate if the ground around them was disturbed, that would kill the very combat engineers attempting to neutralize them. Unteroffizier Peter Hoffmann, a German pioneer who survived the war despite extensive mine clearance duty, described the nightmare. American mines were designed to kill the people trying to clear them. You'd find a mine, start to dig carefully around it, and discover it was connected to another mine beneath it, move the first one, and the second detonates. Or you'd find what looked like a single mine, but it was actually rigged to a hidden charge that exploded when you tried to lift it. They put mines in clusters, so clearing one would detonate others. They put mines under dead bodies, under abandoned equipment, under anything a soldier might move or investigate. After a while, you trusted nothing, touched nothing, assumed everything was trapped. And even then, men died, because the Americans were clever, and we were always one step behind. By the end of the Normandy campaign in August 1944, an estimated 1.5 million mines had been planted by American forces alone, not counting British, Canadian, and German mines. This density of mining transformed much of Normandy into what French civilians would call forbidden zones, areas too dangerous to enter, where mines could kill farmers, children, livestock for decades after the war ended. The long-term humanitarian cost of this mine warfare would haunt Normandy for generations. French mine clearance teams worked for years after the war, removing American, British, and German mines from agricultural land, forests, and residential areas. The last major mine clearance operations in Normandy weren't completed until the 1970s, and even today, occasional mines from 1944 are still discovered and neutralized. The civilian casualties from post-war mine accidents in Normandy numbered in the hundreds. French children playing in fields, farmers plowing land, construction workers excavating building sites, all falling victim to weapons that had been planted decades earlier. The American mining campaign in Normandy represented a revolution in how industrial democracies thought about mine warfare. It demonstrated that mines could be produced in such quantities, deployed so rapidly, and employed so systematically that they became not just defensive weapons, but offensive tools that could shape the battlefield, slow enemy operations, and create psychological effects that amplified their physical impact. The lessons learned in Normandy influenced mine warfare doctrine for decades. American forces in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts continued to employ mines as force multipliers, using industrial capacity and tactical innovation to maximize their effectiveness. The basic principles established in 1944, that mines were cheap, effective, and psychologically devastating, remained valid through subsequent wars. But Normandy also demonstrated the humanitarian costs of indiscriminate mine warfare. The civilian casualties in post-war France, the decades required for clearance, and the permanent transformation of agricultural land into hazardous zones all illustrated the long-term consequences of weapons that, once planted, could not be easily removed and continued killing long after the war ended. Colonel Frank Mitchell, who had supervised the mining operations that killed Hauptmann Weber's men, reflected on this in a 1950 interview. "We used mines because they were effective, because they saved American lives by killing Germans, because they gave us tactical advantages we couldn't achieve any other way. I don't regret that decision. We were at war and I was trying to win while minimizing casualties among the men I was responsible for. But I do regret that we didn't think more carefully about the aftermath, about how those mines would affect French civilians after the war, about how many children would die playing in fields we'd mined in 1944. If I could go back, I'd push for better record-keeping of mine locations, for leaving maps that French authorities could use for clearance. We were focused on winning the war, but we should have been thinking about what came after." The German troops who were stunned when the ground started exploding beneath them had encountered something new in warfare. Not just a weapon, but a system of weapons employed with industrial efficiency and tactical sophistication that transformed the battlefield in ways that traditional military thinking hadn't anticipated. The Americans had taken a defensive weapon, the mine, and turned it into an offensive tool that channeled enemy movement, created psychological pressure, and multiplied the effectiveness of all their other weapons. Hauptmann Ernst Weber survived the war, returned to Munich, and worked as a civil engineer helping rebuild Germany. He never forgot the morning when his company walked into that minefield, never stopped carrying guilt for the men who died following his orders. In his memoirs published in 1968, he wrote, "The Americans fought differently than the Russians, differently than we'd expected. They didn't just try to outfight us, they tried to outthink us, to use their industrial power and organizational skills to create advantages we couldn't counter." The mines were just one example. They had so many mines they could afford to plant them everywhere, could create minefields just to deny us terrain, could mine behind our lines just to cause us problems. We couldn't match that. We didn't have the resources, didn't have the industrial capacity, didn't have the luxury of using weapons so prodigally. The mines didn't win the war by themselves. But they were part of a larger American way of war that we couldn't defeat, a way of war based on having more of everything and using it more effectively. The ground that exploded beneath German troops in Normandy in 1944 represented more than just hidden weapons. It represented the collision between German military tradition, based on skill and tactical excellence, and American industrial warfare, based on overwhelming material superiority and systematic application of resources. The Germans had expected to fight Americans who were less experienced, less skilled, less tactically proficient than themselves. What they encountered instead was an enemy who compensated for any tactical deficiencies through sheer quantity of mines, of artillery shells, of tanks, of aircraft, of everything needed to overwhelm defenders through material superiority. The mines were America's secret weapon, not because they were technologically advanced, they weren't particularly, but because America had so many of them and was willing to use them so freely. That willingness to expend resources without reservation, to mine fields just to deny them to the enemy, to plant millions of mines across the front without worrying about cost, represented a form of warfare that industrially exhausted Germany simply could not match. The ground exploded beneath German troops because America could afford to make it explode, could produce enough mines to make every step dangerous, could employ mine warfare at a scale that transformed the battlefield in fundamental ways. And that ultimately was the lesson of America's secret minefields of 1944, that in industrial warfare, quantity has a quality all its own, that the ability to produce and employ weapons without constraint provides advantages that tactical skill alone cannot overcome, and that the ground itself can become a weapon when one side has enough resources to make it so. Tentar novamente.